I'm Captain Rowan Berg, 32 years old, United States Army. Under the harsh sun of Fort Liberty, North Carolina, I was standing in a ceremony that meant everything. The moment Major General Whitaker was about to present me with the command saber, a voice cut through the national anthem. "You don't deserve to wear that uniform." It was Ethan, my stepbrother. Before anyone could react, he lunged forward, ripping the saber from the general's hands. The edge of the steel slammed against my left hand. Blood. It soaked through the pristine white dress glove. He roared in front of hundreds of people. "You don't belong here, Rowan. You were never one of us." They thought this public humiliation would break me. They didn't know that my blood on this uniform was the most ironclad oath I could ever make. Let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever been treated like a stranger by your own family at the exact moment you needed them most. The heat at Fort Liberty was unforgiving. It shimmered in waves off the vast expanse of the parade ground, baking the scent of freshly cut grass and kiwi shoe polish into the humid North Carolina air. I stood at attention, my spine straight as a ramrod, the dark green fabric of my Army service uniform already starting to feel heavy. The rhythmic, cadenced beat of the ceremonial drums seemed to sync with my own heart. A steady thump, thump, thump that marked the culmination of a lifetime of effort. 17 years. 17 years of pushing my body past its limits, of honing my mind to a razor's edge, of sacrificing normalcy for duty. This moment wasn't just for me. It was for him. For the father I barely knew, First Lieutenant Henry Berg, whose legacy was the compass that had guided my entire life. In the front row of the guest bleachers, I could just make out my mother. She was fanning herself with a program, looking small and overwhelmed by the military precision surrounding her. I allowed myself a flicker of hope. Maybe today, seeing me here, she would finally understand. Maybe she would finally be proud. Major General Whitaker stood before me, his presence as commanding as the flag snapping in the breeze behind him. He was a friend of my father's, a living link to a past I only knew through faded photographs. His eyes, crinkling at the corners, held a warmth that went beyond professional courtesy. It was the look of a mentor, of a man who saw not just the rank on my shoulders, but the journey it took to get here. He took the ceremonial officer's saber from its display, its polished steel glinting under the relentless sun. "Captain Berg," he began, his voice deep and resonant, carrying across the silent field. "On behalf of a grateful nation, and in recognition of your exemplary leadership." He was about to place the hilt in my hand. It was the pinnacle, the symbol of everything I had fought for. And then, a blur of motion from the stands. "You don't deserve that." The voice was a shard of glass in the solemn air. It wasn't just the words. It was the venom they were steeped in, an acid I knew all too well. It sliced through 17 years of carefully constructed walls, straight into the heart of the scared, unwanted girl I once was. My blood ran cold. I didn't need to turn. I knew that voice. Ethan. He vaulted the barrier separating the guests from the field, his face a twisted mask of rage. 2 military police officers started to move, but he was too fast. He lunged, not at me, but at the general, his hands clawing for the saber. He ripped it from Whitaker's grasp with a savage grunt. For a split second, time seemed to warp, the polished blade arcing through the air in a terrifying, beautiful sliver of light. Then it slammed into my hand. It wasn't the blade that hit me, but the heavy steel of the handguard. A sickening, dull crack echoed in my ears, a sound I felt more than heard. A bolt of white-hot agony shot up my arm, so intense it stole my breath. It felt like every small bone in my hand had been shattered by a hammer. Hot. Wet. My eyes, wide with shock, dropped to my left hand. The ceremonial white cotton glove was already blooming with a grotesque flower of crimson. It started as a small stain, then darkened, spreading rapidly through the fibers. Blood. My blood. Staining the symbol of purity and honor. Through the haze of pain, my gaze darted to the stands, searching for my mother. I found her. Her hand was clamped over her mouth, her body shrunken into her seat. I saw a flicker of horror in her eyes, quickly replaced by something else. Fear. The same old paralyzing fear. And then, she did what she always did. She looked away. She turned her head, her eyes finding a point on the far side of the field, anywhere but on her daughter being assaulted. She had abandoned me. Again. Ethan stood over me, panting, the saber clutched in his hand. His face was inches from mine, spittle flying as he roared the words that were the anthem of my childhood. "You were never one of us!" The spell broke. Shouts erupted. The MPs were on him in an instant, a flurry of motion and authority. They tackled him to the ground with professional force. The saber clattered onto the manicured grass. The crowd gasped. The ceremony had dissolved into chaos. My ears were ringing. The pain in my hand was a roaring fire, but my training kicked in, a lifetime of discipline overriding the screaming nerve endings. Assess the situation. Maintain composure. Control the narrative. General Whitaker was by my side, his face a mask of cold fury. He looked from the struggling form of Ethan to my bleeding hand. His voice, when he spoke to me, was low and sharp as a bayonet. "Captain, can you stand and maintain your bearing?" It was a question, but it was also a command. An offer to retreat with dignity or to stand my ground. Retreat was not in my vocabulary. Blood was now dripping from the fingertips of my glove, forming a small dark pool on the polished leather of my dress shoes. Every fiber of my being wanted to collapse, to cradle my broken hand, to scream. But I thought of the young soldiers in formation watching me. I thought of my father's name. I forced my shoulders back, locked my knees, and pulled my chin up. My gaze met the general's. I brought my uninjured right hand up in a salute so crisp, so precise, it could have been cut from stone. "Yes, sir." The words were steady. They didn't betray the tremor of pain shooting through my body. They didn't betray the rage and the profound, soul-crushing hurt. A camera flash exploded in my peripheral vision, searing the moment into history. A local reporter capturing the image that would go viral. The decorated captain, face impassive, blood streaming down her side, rendering a perfect, unwavering salute. They would call it a symbol of discipline. They had no idea it was an act of war. As the MPs dragged Ethan away, still shouting incoherently, a silence fell over the field once more. But this wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of shock. I held my salute, my eyes fixed on the flag, the world narrowing to that single point of focus. The pain was immense, but the wound Ethan had just torn open ran far deeper than bone. It was 17 years old. How, after 17 years, could he still reach me like this? The question of how Ethan could still reach me isn't a question at all. The real question is why I ever thought he couldn't. The roots of that day at Fort Liberty weren't planted in the North Carolina soil. They were sunk deep in the humid, oppressive ground of Charleston, South Carolina, in a house that was as beautiful as it was damned. From the street, our house on South of Broad was a postcard of Southern charm. A grand historic home with double piazzas, gas lanterns that flickered at dusk, and the sweet, heavy scent of magnolias hanging in the air. Tourists would stop to take pictures. They saw heritage and grace. What they couldn't see was the suffocating silence that lived inside, a silence curated and enforced by my stepfather, retired Navy Captain Douglas Porter. Inside, the air didn't smell like magnolias. It smelled of lemon-scented wood polish, Douglas's cigars, and a faint, metallic tang of fear. My mother's entire existence revolved around navigating his moods. Her constant whisper to me was the law of our house. Don't poke the bear, Rowan. Just be quiet. Be good. Being good meant being invisible. It meant walking on the antique heart pine floors without making them creak. It meant reading in my room instead of watching TV in the living room. It meant never, ever bringing up the name Henry Berg. Douglas ruled our home like the deck of a warship, and I was the permanent, unwanted stowaway. The worst of it always came to a head during holidays, when the performance of a happy family was mandatory. I remember one Thanksgiving when I was 14. The dining room was set with my grandmother's old silver and a lace tablecloth so ancient it was the color of cream. The air was filled with the rich smells of roast turkey, sage stuffing, and bourbon-glazed sweet potatoes. Douglas, seated at the head of the table, believed family dinners were a time for moral instruction. My instruction. "Rowan," he'd boomed, his voice silencing the soft clink of silverware. "Ephesians, chapter 6, verse 1. Recite it." I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. All eyes were on me. Ethan, a year older, smirked from across the table. He loved this. "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right," I recited, my voice small. "Louder," Douglas commanded, "as if you mean it." I repeated the words, my face burning. He nodded, satisfied, and began carving the turkey. For a moment, I thought I was safe, but my hands were trembling. As I reached for my water glass, my fork slipped from my grasp, clattering onto the pristine tablecloth and leaving a small greasy stain from the gravy. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavy and cold. Douglas put down the carving knife with slow, deliberate precision. He didn't yell. That wasn't his way, not at first. He just stared at the stain, then at me, his eyes like chips of ice. "Clumsy," he said, the word a quiet indictment. He picked up my plate, piled high with turkey and all the fixings I'd been dreaming of all day, walked over to the grand fireplace, and scraped the entire meal into the dying embers. It sizzled and smoked, the smell of burnt offering filling the room. "You will eat in the kitchen," he said, his voice flat. "A bowl of cold grits. That's what you deserve." I looked at my mother, pleading. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She just stared at her own plate, her hands clenched in her lap. Ethan's smirk had widened into a full-blown grin. He knew he'd be getting my share of the pumpkin pie. I spent that Thanksgiving in the kitchen, spooning tasteless, lumpy grits into my mouth while the sounds of laughter and conversation drifted in from the other room. It wasn't about the food, it was about the humiliation. It was about being publicly marked as unworthy. Later that evening, when Douglas was in his study, my mother slipped into the kitchen. She didn't say a word. She just pressed a small broken piece of pie crust into my hand before scurrying away, as if her small act of kindness was a crime. But Ethan was the one who knew how to turn cruelty into an art form. He knew the one thing I had left of my real father was his military dog tag. It was my sacred object. I kept it in a small wooden box on my nightstand. One sweltering summer afternoon, he stormed into my room after I'd beaten him in a school sailing race. He saw the box, knew exactly what was inside, and snatched it. "What's this, Rowan?" he sneered, dangling the chain. "Thinking about your dead hero, Daddy?" "Give it back, Ethan," I begged, my voice cracking. He just laughed. He ran out of the house, down to the marshy edge of the Cooper River at the end of our property. I chased after him, but I was too late. With a final, taunting look, he drew his arm back and flung the dog tag out over the water. It made a tiny, insignificant plink as it disappeared into the murky depths. I didn't even think. I waded into the pluff mud, the thick, smelly sludge sucking at my sneakers. I searched for hours, my hands plunging into the dark water, feeling for that small piece of metal. Crabs scuttled over my fingers. The sun beat down on my back. I cried until I had no tears left. I never found it. When I finally trudged back to the house, covered in mud and defeat, my mother was waiting on the back porch. She didn't hug me. She didn't ask what was wrong. Her first words were a hissed whisper. "Look at the mess you've made. You're tracking mud all over the piazza. Go upstairs and shower, now. And don't you dare say a word of this to your stepfather." Protecting Douglas's peace was always more important than protecting me. His anger was the sun our entire family orbited, and my pain was just a planet to be sacrificed to keep the system stable. My escape hatch appeared in the form of a flyer in my high school guidance counselor's office, JROTC, Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps. It promised order, discipline, and purpose. It was everything my home was not. The first time I put on the uniform, a crisp, second-hand polyester uniform, I felt like I was putting on armor. Our instructor, Sergeant First Class Walsh, a tough-as-nails Marine veteran, saw something in me I didn't see in myself. He didn't see a clumsy, quiet girl. He saw potential. Discipline begins where excuses end, Berg. He'd bark at us during drills. He called me Berg, not Rowan, not sweetheart, not clumsy girl. Berg. It sounded like respect. It sounded like I was someone. He told me I had leadership qualities. It was the first time anyone had ever told me I was good at anything. The night Douglas died of a massive heart attack in his armchair, I didn't cry. I felt a quiet, profound sense of relief, as if a great weight had been lifted from the house. While my mother and Ethan planned a grand funeral befitting a retired Navy captain, I packed a single duffel bag. A year later, on my 18th birthday, I stood at the door, ready to leave for basic training. Ethan stood there, arms crossed, leaning against the doorframe. He looked me up and down, a contemptuous sneer on his face. "You think you're so tough in that uniform?" "You'll be back," he said. "You'll come crawling back." I just looked past him, at the open road beyond our perfectly manicured lawn. The world was waiting. If you've ever had a person in your life who seemed to enjoy your pain, who went out of their way to break you down, please hit the like button for every single person who found a way to stand back up. And in the comments, just type a single word: survivor. Let's see how many of us are out there. As I walked away without a backward glance, his final words followed me down the driveway. Let's see how long it takes the world to break you. Ethan's parting words were meant to be a curse. Let's see how long it takes the world to break you. He thought the world was just a larger version of our house, a place designed to crush anyone who didn't fit. He was wrong. The world didn't break me. It forged me. My forging began at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, just a 2-hour drive from Charleston, but a universe away. The bus ride there was quiet, filled with nervous teenagers trying to look tough. I just stared out the window, watching the Spanish moss and grand old houses of the Low Country give way to pine forests and strip malls. I wasn't nervous. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was heading home. Fort Jackson was hot, humid, and loud. From the moment we stepped off the bus, we were enveloped in a storm of structured chaos. Drill sergeants, with their campaign hats pulled low, descended on us like hawks, their voices rasps of pure authority. They screamed at us to get our bags, to form lines, to stand straighter, to move faster. Everything was a command. Everything had a purpose. And I loved it. The shouting wasn't like Douglas's simmering rage. This wasn't personal. It was professional. The screams were designed to break down our civilian identities, to strip away our egos, and to build us back up as a unit, as soldiers. In the suffocating, toxic silence of my childhood home, I had felt utterly alone. Here, in the middle of constant noise, surrounded by 50 other sweating, scared recruits, I felt safe. I wasn't Rowan Porter, the clumsy girl. I was Private Berg, a blank slate, and my value would be determined by what I did, not by who I was related to. I threw myself into basic training with a ferocity that surprised even myself. While others complained about the pre-dawn runs, the endless push-ups, and the bland food in the mess hall, I welcomed it all. The burn in my muscles was a clean pain, an honest pain. It was a feeling of getting stronger, not weaker. I learned to assemble and disassemble an M16 until I could do it blindfolded. I learned to march in formation, to navigate by the stars, to push my body one more mile when my lungs were screaming for air. I wanted to be the best. Not to prove Ethan wrong, but to prove Sergeant Walsh right. But there was a problem. My greatest survival skill at home, my silence, was a liability here. I did everything I was told, perfectly and without question. I was disciplined, focused, and efficient. But I was quiet. I kept to myself, my face an impassive mask I had perfected over years of avoiding Douglas's wrath. My primary drill sergeant, a man named Drill Sergeant Rivas, didn't see discipline. He saw a problem. One afternoon, during rifle qualifications, he pulled me aside. He got right in my face, his breath smelling of stale coffee. "What is wrong with you, Berg?" he barked, his voice low and menacing. "You just stand there, like a robot. No emotion, no fire. You got no soul? You're not scared? You're not anything?" His words hit me like a physical blow. No soul. It was what Douglas and Ethan had always implied, that I was empty, that something vital was missing. I had run away from one prison only to find myself in another, judged by a different kind of warden for the exact same crime of being quiet. The carefully constructed armor I'd built began to crack. That night, I hid in a bathroom stall, long after lights out. I sat on the cold tile floor, my knees pulled to my chest, and for the first time since leaving Charleston, I cried. They were silent, choked sobs, the kind I had perfected as a child so as not to wake the bear. I felt a wave of despair wash over me. Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe I was broken. Maybe there was no place in the world for me. The stall door creaked open. I held my breath. It was Private Sarah Jenkins, a tough, wiry girl from rural Alabama whose bunk was next to mine. I'd heard whispers about why she'd joined, something about a father with a heavy hand and a drinking problem. She didn't say anything. She just sat on the floor outside my stall. A moment later, a small, slightly melted Hershey's chocolate bar slid under the door. "Eat it," she whispered. "Sugar helps, and tomorrow we're gonna run so fast, we'll leave Rivas tasting our dust." It was the first act of unconditional kindness I had received in my entire life. I ate the chocolate, its sweetness a stark contrast to the bitterness in my soul. Sarah didn't ask me to explain. She didn't need to. She just knew. We were both running from the same ghosts. We were survivors. From that day on, she was my family. And we did run faster. We pushed each other, studied together, and made a silent pact to get through this together. They thought they could break us, but they only made us harder than steel. My performance, combined with my high test scores, got me noticed. I was recommended for officer candidate school. OCS was a different world. Less about breaking you down, and more about building you up as a leader. It was there that I first met Lieutenant Colonel Whitaker. He was the command overseeing the OCS program, a man who carried an aura of quiet authority that made even the drill sergeants stand a little straighter. He knew my father. He'd served with him long ago. He called me into his office one day, a file on his desk with my name on it. I stood at attention in front of his desk, my heart pounding. Rivas's performance review was in that file. I was sure of it. Whitaker motioned for me to sit, a gesture that was so unexpected it felt like a trick. He didn't look at the file. He looked at me. "Drill Sergeant Rivas says you're emotionless, Berg," he began, his voice calm and even. "He says he can't get a read on you." I stared straight ahead, my face a blank canvas. "Yes, sir." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes analytical, but not unkind. "I don't see that. I see focus. I see a woman who has learned to channel every ounce of her energy into the task at hand. Your silence isn't emptiness, candidate, it's strength. Your father, Henry, had that same strength. He was the calmest man I ever knew in a firefight. He said my father's name. He acknowledged my silence not as a flaw, but as a legacy. For the first time, someone had looked past the quiet exterior and seen the steel beneath. It was like he had handed me a compass, a way to finally understand myself. The quiet girl wasn't broken. She was a warrior in waiting. "Don't let anyone turn your strength into a prison," he said, closing the file. "Now get out of here and go lead." I left his office feeling taller, lighter. The invisible weight I had carried for 18 years was finally gone. I graduated from OCS at the top of my class, receiving my commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. As I stood on that graduation stage, shaking Whitaker's hand, I didn't think about the house in Charleston. I didn't think about Ethan or Douglas. I was no longer a survivor running from a painful past. I was a leader, marching toward a future I would build myself. I had the rank. I had the career. But 16 years later, a phone call from Charleston would remind me that the past never truly stays buried. For 16 years, the world didn't break me, it made me. I served tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. I earned the respect of my soldiers and the trust of my commanders. I became Captain Rowan Berg, a woman defined by her uniform, her discipline, and her unwavering control. The quiet, broken girl from Charleston was a ghost, a memory locked away in a part of my mind I rarely visited. I thought she was buried for good. Then came the phone call. It was the summer before the ceremony at Fort Liberty. I was stationed in Kuwait, the air a blistering 120 degrees. The call came over a crackling satellite line. It was Ethan. His voice was slick with a practiced, somber tone I didn't recognize. "Mom was sick," he said. "Cancer. It was bad. The doctors weren't giving her much time." "She's asking for you, Rowan," he'd said. The lie was so obvious it was almost insulting, but it didn't matter. It was my mother. I put in for emergency leave the next day. Flying back, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. It wasn't just worry for my mother, it was the dread of returning to that house. As the plane descended into Charleston, I saw the familiar steeple-dotted skyline and the shimmering waters of the harbor. It was a beautiful city, a city tourists flocked to. To me, it was a beautiful cage. The house on South of Broad looked exactly the same, perfectly preserved in its southern grandeur. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. The oppressive silence I remembered from Douglas's reign was still there, but it was different now. It was colder, more clinical. Then I saw them. Small, discreet security cameras mounted in the corners of every room. In the living room, the hallway, even pointing towards the kitchen. Ethan greeted me at the door, wrapping me in a hug that felt like a cage of snakes. He had grown heavier, softer, but his eyes held the same resentful glint. "Rowan, so glad you could make it," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "Mom's resting in her room." I found her in the master bedroom, the same room she had once shared with Douglas. She was swimming in a sea of pillows, looking frail and impossibly small. The vibrant woman I remembered was gone, replaced by a pale, hollowed-out version of herself. Her eyes, once bright blue, were dull and clouded. "Mom?" I said softly. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, a spark of recognition. "Rowan!" she breathed. Ethan bustled in behind me, carrying a glass filled with a thick, greenish liquid. "Here you go, Mom," he said cheerfully. "Time for your special health juice." He held the straw to her lips, and she drank obediently, her eyes never leaving my face. I watched the transaction with a growing sense of alarm. The health juice, the cameras, the vacant look in her eyes. It felt less like care and more like control. He was treating her like a prisoner, not a patient. "She has good days and bad days," Ethan said, patting my shoulder. "I'm managing her finances, her medications. It's a full-time job. But what are sons for, right?" The next day, I found a moment when Ethan was out running errands. I sat on the edge of my mother's bed. I needed to talk to her, alone. "Mom, are you okay?" I asked, my voice low. Is he taking good care of you?" She looked towards the door, her body tense. She leaned closer and whispered, her breath papery and thin. "Ethan is a good boy. He takes such good care of me." But her eyes screamed a different story. They were wide with a familiar terror, the same terror she'd had when Douglas was alive. She was a hostage, and she was begging me to understand without saying the words. That was all I needed. I was Captain Rowanberg. I solved problems. I took action. I went downstairs, walked out onto the piazza, and called the Charleston Police Department. I explained the situation calmly and professionally. I was an active-duty Army captain, and I had reason to believe my terminally ill mother was being isolated and possibly over-medicated by my stepbrother. 2 officers arrived 20 minutes later. They were polite, professional, their faces impassive. I explained my concerns again, pointing out the cameras, the strange juice, my mother's fearful demeanor. They listened patiently. Then, Ethan came home. The transformation was instantaneous. He saw the police cruiser and burst into tears. He played the part of the devoted, heartbroken son perfectly. He sobbed about how he had given up his life to care for his dying mother, how difficult it was, how his estranged stepsister had shown up out of the blue and was causing all this stress. The officers went inside to speak with my mother. Ethan and I waited on the porch. He wouldn't look at me, but a smug, triumphant smile played on his lips. I knew what was happening. I knew what she would do. She would choose the bear. One of the officers came back out, his face set with a look of finality. "Ma'am," he said, addressing me, "your mother has assured us she is perfectly fine and that Mr. Porter is providing excellent care. In fact," she said you've been under a lot of stress from your military service and that you're harassing her. She has asked us to escort you from the property." The words hung in the humid air. I was being thrown out of my own mother's house, by the police, at her request. "I'm a captain in the United States Army," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "I have a security clearance. I am not unstable." The officer's eyes were sympathetic, but his hands were tied. "I'm sorry, Captain Berg. With all due respect, this is a family matter. We can't intervene unless she tells us she's in danger." They escorted me to my rental car. I, who had commanded troops in a war zone, was treated like a common trespasser. The system I had sworn an oath to defend was utterly powerless to stop this kind of quiet, insidious evil. My mother passed away 3 days later. At the funeral, Ethan was the star. Accepting condolences with a tear-streaked face, I stood in the back, invisible. After the service, while sorting through some of her personal effects at the house, I found it. Tucked inside her old jewelry box was a yellowed newspaper clipping. The obituary for my father, First Lieutenant Henry Berg, from a military newspaper dated nearly 30 years ago. And there, underlined in a faint, shaky pen, was a single line from the list of survivors. "He is survived by his daughter, Rowan." She had remembered. Through all the years of silence, fear, and submission, she had held on to that one small piece of me, of him. She had remembered. I took the clipping and walked out of that house for the last time. Ethan was standing on the porch, watching me go. I stopped at the bottom of the steps and turned to face him. The grief in my chest was a cold, hard stone. "You are going to pay for this," I said. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, a mission objective. This time, I wasn't running away. I was going to war. That image of the underlined obituary clutched in my hand, and that promise I made on those steps. That's why, a year later, even as the blood ran down my arm, I stood my ground at Fort Liberty. The promise I made on my mother's porch was a quiet declaration of war. I expected a long, grueling campaign fought in the shadows through legal filings and private investigators. I never imagined the first battle would be broadcast live on national television, with me as the unwilling star. Before I was even discharged from the on-base clinic at Fort Liberty, my hand set in a cast, diagnosed with 3 fractured metacarpals, I was no longer just Captain Berg. I was a headline. The blood-stained salute. The image was everywhere. That single, searing photograph taken by a local reporter had gone viral. It was on CNN, playing on a loop, a panel of experts debating its meaning. It was the lead story on Fox News, commentators praising my grit and unbreakable discipline. My face, impassive and stoic, was plastered across Twitter and Facebook, turned into a meme, a symbol. They called me a hero, an icon of American fortitude. They didn't see me 10 minutes after that photo was taken, kneeling on the cold tile floor of a bathroom stall, vomiting into the toilet from the sheer shock and pain. They didn't see the shaking in my good hand as I tried to sip water. They saw a symbol, a two-dimensional figure they could project their own beliefs onto. They didn't see the woman whose deepest, most private wound had just been ripped open for the world to see. The Army, true to form, moved quickly to control the narrative. The Pentagon's Public Affairs Office released a statement within hours. It was a masterpiece of military precision, commending my extraordinary composure under duress and stating that Captain Berg's actions exemplify the highest standards of discipline and honor within the United States Army. They confirmed that a civilian, Ethan Porter, had been detained and was facing charges. They omitted our relationship. It was clean. It was professional. It protected the institution. General Whitaker called me personally in my temporary room in the officers' quarters. "Just breathe, Rowan," he said, his voice a steady anchor in the hurricane. "Let us handle the press. Your only job right now is to heal. We've got your six." I was grateful for his protection, but it couldn't shield me from the fallout. My private war had become public property, and everyone wanted a piece of it. The story became a political football. On the right, I was hailed as a paragon of traditional military values, a rebuke to a supposedly soft generation. On the left, the incident was framed as a symptom of toxic masculinity and unresolved violence inherent in military culture. My pain was just ammunition for their arguments. Neither side seemed to care about the truth. Neither side understood that the uniform wasn't the cause of my wound. It was the only armor I'd ever had against it. Life on base became a minefield. The other soldiers didn't know what to say. I could feel their eyes on me in the PX, in the mess hall. They would whisper as I passed. Some gave me nods of respect, a silent acknowledgement of strength. Others looked at me with pity, their eyes soft with a sympathy I found suffocating. I didn't want their praise, and I certainly didn't want their pity. Both felt like a violation. They were looking at the icon, not at me. The icon was strong. The woman was falling apart. I retreated into myself, spending my off-duty hours in my room. The silence a welcome relief from the noise of public opinion. I felt adrift, unsure of my next move. My promise to my mother felt hollow now. Ethan's attack wasn't just on me, it was on the institution I loved, and I felt a paralyzing sense of shame. Then, the letters started arriving. At first, it was just a trickle, forwarded from the base mailroom. Then it became a steady stream, then a flood. Sacks of mail, filled with letters from all over the country, from people I had never met. I started opening them one evening, more out of a sense of duty than curiosity. Many were from young soldiers, privates, and specialists who wrote about their own silent battles. A soldier whose father belittled his service. A female officer whose husband controlled her finances. They saw my salute not as an act of military discipline, but as an act of personal defiance they wished they had the strength to make. There were letters from military spouses, from mothers and fathers who had watched their children struggle. They wrote about the invisible wars families fight behind closed doors, far from any foreign battlefield. They thanked me for not flinching, for showing them what resilience looked like. Each letter was a small crack of light in the darkness that had surrounded me. These people weren't talking to the icon. They were talking to me. They saw the truth behind the picture. They understood. One evening, I opened a letter with a return address from a small town in Texas. The handwriting was the shaky, deliberate script of an old man. "Dear Captain Berg," it began. "My name is Sergeant Major, retired Frank Miller. I served 22 years in the Army, 2 tours in Vietnam. I've seen men fall from enemy fire, from disease, from sheer exhaustion. I've seen a lot of things that are called brave, but I've seen very few people remain standing after being betrayed by their own kin. That kind of wound cuts deeper than any bullet. That salute of yours, with the blood on your glove, was the single bravest act I've seen in 30 years. You didn't do it for the cameras or the regulations. You did it for yourself. You told that bastard and the whole world that you would not be broken. You stood your ground. Thank you, Captain." From one old soldier to another. I held the letter in my hand, the paper trembling, and for the first time since that day, I cried. Not tears of pain or shame, but tears of recognition, of release. Frank Miller, from his small town in Texas, had seen me. He understood the battlefield I was really on. I sat there for a long time, the letter in my lap, the pile of mail a testament to a silent, unseen army of survivors. I realized this was no longer just my story. It wasn't about Ethan's jealousy or my mother's fear. It was about Frank Miller in Texas. It was about the young private whose father called him a failure. It was about every single person who had ever been made to feel worthless by the people who were supposed to love them. I couldn't stay silent. Not anymore. My war wasn't a source of shame. It was a source of strength. And maybe, just maybe, my story could be a weapon for them too. I stood up, the last of my hesitation gone, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. I knew exactly what I had to do next. The next day, I walked into the Charleston law office of Nancy Given. The letters gave me a purpose, but it was the Army's investigation that gave me a target. The Criminal Investigation Division, or CID, was thorough, efficient, and impersonal. They interviewed me, General Whitaker, and a dozen other witnesses. They also interviewed Ethan. The final report landed on my desk a few weeks later. It officially cleared me of any misconduct. Ethan, however, got little more than a slap on the wrist. He was charged with disorderly conduct and trespassing on a federal installation. The punishment? A fine and a permanent ban from all military bases. That was it. Military justice had done its job. It had protected the sanctity of the ceremony. But it had done nothing to address the real crime. It wasn't enough. I didn't just want justice for a ruined ceremony. I wanted justice for my mother. The CID report included a transcript of Ethan's interview. Reading his words felt like swallowing poison. "She provoked me," he'd claimed, his voice dripping with self-pity. "She always had to be better than me, rubbing her fancy career in our faces. She took everything from me, even my own mother's love." His lies were so blatant, so pathetic, they didn't even make me angry. They clarified everything. They became fuel. I folded the report, my decision made. My fight with Ethan wasn't a military matter. It was a civil one. I requested a meeting with General Whitaker. We met in his office, the same room where he'd once defended my silence. I laid out my intention, my voice as steady as my gaze. "Sir, I'm going to sue him," I said. "For fraud, for breach of fiduciary duty, for every dollar he stole from my mother." He listened without interruption, his hands steepled on his desk. When I finished, he didn't try to talk me out of it. He didn't warn me about the potential mess or the impact on my career. He just nodded slowly, a grim look of approval in his eyes. "Good," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Ethan is a creature of the dark. He's used to manipulating people in the shadows where no one is watching. We won't fight him there." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "We will attack in daylight. We will drag his actions out into the public record, piece by piece, and let the truth be our weapon." Attack in daylight. The phrase became my mission statement. It was a strategy I understood. It was a language I spoke. Finding the right weapon was the next step. I needed a civilian lawyer, someone who understood the murky battleground of family law and financial exploitation. My research led me to one name, in Charleston: Nancy Given. Her reputation was formidable. She wasn't just a lawyer, she was a shark who specialized in dismantling financial predators who hid behind the shield of family matters. Her law office was in a beautifully restored historic building downtown, a world away from the rigid functionality of Fort Liberty. Nancy Given herself was a woman in her late 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of my toughest instructors. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've read the news, Captain Berg," she said, gesturing for me to sit. Her office was filled with books, not just law tomes, but works of history and philosophy. She looked at my cast, then at the faint, fading scar on the back of my hand. "I know what happened at the ceremony. Tell me what happened before." I spent the next hour laying out the facts, presenting the case with the same precision I would use to brief a mission. I detailed my mother's illness, the cameras in the house, the suspicious health juice, and the police report that labeled me as the aggressor. I spoke without emotion, focusing on the tactical details. When I finished, Nancy was silent for a long moment, studying my face. "Are you ready for this fight, Captain?" she asked, her tone serious. "He will use your service against you. He'll claim you have PTSD, that you're unstable. He'll say you were an absent daughter looking for a payday. It's going to get dirty." "Ma'am," I replied, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I've spent the better part of my career in the deserts of Kuwait and the mountains of Afghanistan. I'm not afraid of getting dirty." A slow smile spread across her face. "Good. Then let's go hunting." And so began my war on two fronts. By day, I was Captain Berg, commanding my unit at Fort Liberty, ensuring my soldiers were trained, equipped, and ready. My performance had to be flawless. I couldn't give anyone a reason to believe Ethan's inevitable lies about my stability. But by night, my apartment became a command center. Nancy would email me batches of documents she'd subpoenaed: my mother's bank statements, pharmacy records, credit card bills. I would stay up until 2 in the morning, a pot of black coffee my only companion, highlighting every suspicious transaction, cross-referencing dates, and building a timeline. The exhaustion was a constant, heavy weight on my shoulders. I would fall into bed for a few hours of restless sleep, only to wake up at 500 for a 5-mile run, pushing my body to punish the weakness my mind was feeling. The picture that emerged from those documents was uglier than I could have imagined. It was a methodical, ruthless plundering. Tens of thousands of dollars siphoned from my mother's retirement accounts. There was the $10,000 down payment on a new Ford F-150, a $5,000 charge for a base boat, thousands more spent at expensive restaurants, on golf trips, on things my frail, bedridden mother could never have used or approved. He hadn't just been controlling her. He had been bleeding her dry, spending her life savings while she wasted away. Each receipt, each withdrawal slip, was a piece of ammunition. Each line item was a confirmation of his betrayal. The work was grueling, and it forced me to relive my mother's final, lonely months over and over again. But with every piece of evidence, my resolve hardened. Have you ever had to be the one to dig through the painful facts? To be the detective in your own family's tragedy, just to find the truth? If you know what that lonely, exhausting fight feels like, hit the like button. In the comments, just write, "I see you." Because we need to know we're not alone in this fight. One night, staring at a bank statement that showed a huge withdrawal on the day before my mother died, I felt a cold clarity wash over me. General Whitaker was right. The darkness was Ethan's territory. It was time to drag him out of it. It was time to attack in daylight. Nancy filed the lawsuit the next week, a thick stack of paper detailing every allegation of fraud and exploitation. The war had officially begun. The trial in Charleston began on a sweltering October day. The air inside the historic courthouse was thick and still, heavy with the weight of unspoken stories. I walked through the polished double doors, not in a civilian suit, but in my full Army Class A uniform. The green jacket, the ribbons on my chest, the polished brass. I wanted Ethan to see it. I wanted him to face the uniform he tried to disgrace, the institution he could never understand. The courtroom was packed. Reporters scribbled in notebooks, their presence turning our private war into a public spectacle. This was it. This was daylight. Ethan had been forced to sell my mother's car to hire a lawyer, a slick, bottom-feeding attorney named Peterson, whose strategy was obvious from his opening statement: to paint me as a greedy, unstable, and attention-seeking daughter, and Ethan as the selfless, devoted caregiver. Nancy Given dismantled him with the calm, methodical precision of a surgeon. She didn't rely on theatrics. She relied on facts. She presented the evidence we had spent months compiling, projecting it onto a large screen for the jury to see. Bank statements with Ethan's signature on withdrawal slips for thousands of dollars. Credit card bills showing lavish spending on things a dying woman would never buy. Pharmacy records detailing prescriptions for sedatives that seemed to increase whenever large sums of money were moved. Then she played the audio from the security cameras, the audio Ethan didn't know existed. The jury heard him not as a loving son, but as a tyrant, his voice sharp and cruel as he berated my mother for being too slow, for spilling a glass of water, for asking a question. The courtroom was dead silent, the only sound Ethan's recorded voice echoing through the chamber. Then, Nancy called me to the stand. I walked to the witness box, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly at the jury. A panel of ordinary Charleston citizens. I didn't look at Ethan. Nancy's questioning was direct. "Captain Berg, please turn your attention to the document on the screen. It's a bank withdrawal slip dated May 14th. Do you recognize it?" "Yes, I do." My voice was clear and steady. No emotion, just facts. "Can you tell the jury what it shows?" It shows a cash withdrawal of $10,000 from my mother's primary checking account, I stated. It was used as a down payment for a 20-foot base boat. For an hour, we went through it all. Every transaction, every lie. I wasn't the victim on the stand. I wasn't the abandoned daughter. I was a credible witness, a United States Army captain presenting an after-action report on a campaign of theft and deception. My silence, the very thing I'd been punished for my entire life, had become my greatest weapon. It gave my testimony an undeniable weight, an authority that Ethan's blustering denials couldn't touch. Peterson, Ethan's lawyer, tried his best on cross-examination. He brought up my service, twisting it into a weapon just as Nancy predicted. "Captain, isn't it true you've served in active combat zones?" he asked, his voice oozing with false concern. "Yes, that's correct." "And these experiences, they can be very stressful, can't they? Leading to conditions like PTSD. "Combat is stressful," I replied calmly. "That is why the Army trains us to be resilient, to be clear-headed under pressure." He couldn't rattle me. My answers were short, precise, and devoid of the emotional outburst he was hoping to provoke. He was losing, and he knew it. But Nancy had saved her masterstroke for last. The plaintiff calls Major General Whitaker to the stand. A ripple of murmurs went through the courtroom. The bailiff called the name, and the doors at the back of the room opened. General Whitaker walked in, dressed in his own immaculate Class A uniform. The array of ribbons on his chest was a testament to a lifetime of service and honor, his 2 stars glinting on his shoulders. He walked with an air of absolute command, and as he passed the jury box, every single person in that room, judge, jury, and reporters, sat up a little straighter. His presence filled the space, a physical manifestation of integrity. Peterson, looking visibly shaken, tried to object, but was overruled. Nancy got straight to the point. "General, you've known Captain Berg for many years?" "I have," Whitaker confirmed, his voice calm and powerful. "And I knew her father before her. The Bergs are a family of honor." Peterson got his chance to cross-examine. It was a fatal mistake. "General," he began, trying to sound bold, "you've heard the defense's position that Captain Berg's combat experience may have left her unstable?" General Whitaker looked at Peterson, then he turned his gaze to the jury. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Sir," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "what you call instability, I call extraordinary composure. What you call emotionless, I call focus. I have commanded thousands of soldiers in my career. Captain Berg is one of the finest officers I have ever had the privilege to serve with. She is the living embodiment of honor, integrity, and selfless service. Concepts that your client, Mr. Porter, a man who would steal from his own dying mother, could never possibly comprehend." He paused, letting the words land. "He is a coward. She is a soldier." It was over. Peterson sat down, defeated. The judge called for a recess. As they led the jury out, I saw Ethan's face. It was pale, sweaty, and his bravado was gone, replaced by the panicked look of a cornered rat. He fired his lawyer right there in the courtroom, shouting that he would represent himself. That was his final, self-destructive act. When the trial resumed, Ethan stood before the jury, his voice cracking, his hands shaking. He didn't present evidence. He didn't make a legal argument. He just unraveled. "She's lying," he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "All of it. She was never there for Mom. I was the one. I did everything." His voice rose to a hysterical pitch. "Mom loved me more. She always loved me more. This bitch just wants the money. She was always jealous of me." He had just confessed. In front of the judge, the jury, and a room full of reporters, he had confessed the motive behind every action, his pathetic, all-consuming jealousy. The jury was out for exactly 45 minutes. When they filed back in, their faces were grim and resolute. The foreman handed the verdict to the bailiff. The judge read it aloud, his voice devoid of emotion. "On the charge of fraud, we the jury find the defendant guilty. On the charge of exploitation of a vulnerable adult, we find the defendant Guilty. Guilty on all counts. Ethan just stood there, his mouth hanging open, as two sheriff's deputies moved to stand behind him. He looked at me, his eyes wide with disbelief, as if he still couldn't understand how this had happened. I met his gaze, my face a mask of stone. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the silent room. I had won. The war was over. So why didn't I feel victorious? The click of the handcuffs should have been the sound of victory. It should have been the final note in a long, discordant symphony of injustice. The reporters rushed out of the courtroom to file their stories. Nancy gave my shoulder a firm, congratulatory squeeze, and the world saw a simple headline: Daughter gets justice for mother. It was a clean, satisfying ending. But as I stood there, watching the deputies lead Ethan away, I didn't feel the triumphant release I had expected. There was no surge of joy, no sense of peace. There was only a vast, echoing silence. The silence of a battlefield after the fighting is over. The war that had defined my entire existence, the singular mission that had driven me for decades, first to escape, then to overcome, then to conquer, was finished. And in its place, there was nothing. The Army, in its infinite wisdom, knew I needed a change of scenery. General Whitaker called it a cool-down assignment. I was transferred from the high operational tempo of Fort Liberty to a quiet, administrative desk job at a logistics command in Richmond, Virginia. My new role was to analyze supply chain efficiencies. It was important work, I was told. It felt like being put in a closet. Richmond was a city steeped in history, a place of brick-lined streets, stately monuments, and the slow, meandering James River. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. And its peace terrified me. For my entire life, I had thrived in conflict. The quiet tyranny of my childhood home had been replaced by the structured chaos of the Army. I knew how to operate in a war zone, both external and internal. I did not know how to operate in peacetime. The silence of my small apartment in Richmond was more deafening than the roar of a drill sergeant at Fort Jackson. Every morning, I would wake up at 0500, a habit ingrained in me, and go for a run along the riverbank. I'd watch the sun rise over the water, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. It was serene, and it felt completely alien. I was a soldier without a war, a weapon without a target. I had spent my life building armor, and now there were no incoming rounds. The sheer weight of the armor itself was crushing me. As part of my cool-down, I was required to attend weekly sessions with a behavioral health officer, an Army psychologist named Dr. Evans. She was a kind, patient woman with intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than I was willing to show. For weeks, we talked about the trial, about Ethan, about my mother. I recounted the events with the same dispassionate clarity I'd used on the witness stand. I was a good soldier, following procedure. Then one day, she shifted her line of questioning. She put down her pen, leaned forward, and asked me a simple question that completely disarmed me. "Rowan," she said gently, "you've spent your life being a survivor and then a soldier. But take those two labels away. If you are not a survivor and you are not a soldier, who are you?" The question hung in the air. I opened my mouth to answer, and nothing came out. For the first time in my adult life, I had no answer. Who was I? My entire identity had been forged in the crucible of resistance. I was the girl who endured Douglas. I was the recruit who survived basic training. I was the officer who fought for her mother. My sense of self was built on the foundation of what I was fighting against. With Ethan in prison and the war over, the foundation had crumbled. I was lost. I'd been trained to be invulnerable, to build walls so high and so thick that nothing could penetrate them. Now, in the quiet safety of this therapist's office, I realized I had to learn how to do the opposite. I had to learn how to be vulnerable. I had to learn how to feel the wounds I had never allowed myself to acknowledge. That weekend, General Whitaker drove up from North Carolina to check on me. We sat on the small balcony of my apartment, watching the evening settle over the city. He'd brought a bottle of Blanton's, a good Kentucky bourbon. He poured 2 glasses, the amber liquid catching the last rays of sunlight. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the way old soldiers can. He didn't ask me about therapy. He didn't ask me how I was adjusting. He knew. It feels empty, doesn't it? He said finally, swirling the bourbon in his glass. I just nodded, unable to find the words. I felt the same way when I came back from my last command. He continued, his voice quiet and reflective. You spend years focused on a single mission, a single enemy, and then it's over. The silence is the hardest part. He took a slow sip. You've been fighting your whole life, Rowan. First, it was them. Then it was the Army's standards. Then it was the trial. You're a master of survival. He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with a paternal wisdom. But some wars you don't win. You just outlive them. You're used to surviving. Now, it's time to learn how to live. His words didn't magically solve anything, but they planted a seed. Learn how to live. It was a mission I had no training for. Where did I even begin? That night, I couldn't sleep. I found myself online, researching the Army's various support programs. There were robust, well-funded programs for PTSD, for substance abuse, for transitioning to civilian life. But I realized there was nothing for the soldiers fighting the wars I'd fought. There was no official protocol for the soldier whose family was their primary battlefield. No support system for those dealing with financial abuse or emotional manipulation from the very people they were supposed to be able to trust back home. A thought began to form, a faint glimmer of light in the fog of my confusion. My war wasn't a unique, isolated event. It was a silent epidemic. I had been given a mission. I just hadn't recognized it yet. I realized then, my war wasn't over. It was just beginning a new mission. General Whitaker's advice to learn how to live was a mission objective without a map. I felt like a newly commissioned lieutenant again, full of theory but lacking practical experience. I was sitting in my sterile office in Richmond, staring at supply chain logistics charts, feeling more lost than ever when my new mission walked through the door. She was a private first class, barely 20 years old, with nervous eyes and hands that wouldn't stay still. She stood at attention in front of my desk, so rigid she was almost trembling. "Ma'am, sorry to bother you, Captain Berg," she stammered. "I'm PFC Miller." "At ease, Private," I said, motioning to the chair. "What can I do for you?" She sat on the edge of the seat, her knuckles white as she gripped her patrol cap. "Ma'am, I saw your story on the news. The thing with your family." She took a shaky breath. "My husband's family, back home in Ohio. They control all my finances. My paycheck gets direct deposited into an account with his mother's name on it. They send me a small allowance. They say it's to help us save, but..." Her voice broke, and a tear traced a path down her cheek. "I don't even have enough money to buy my own shampoo at the PX. I don't know what to do. I feel so stupid." I looked at this young soldier, a woman trained to face enemies of the state, who was being systematically dismantled by her own family. And in her terrified, ashamed eyes, I saw myself. I saw the girl who was told a dog tag was just a piece of metal. I saw the woman who was escorted from her mother's home by the police. The emptiness I had been feeling for months was suddenly replaced by a white-hot surge of protective anger. This wasn't just my story. This was PFC Miller's story. And how many others were there like her? That night, I didn't analyze supply chains. I mapped out a new kind of battlefield. The Army had taught us how to operate a tank, how to field strip a rifle, how to survive in the desert. But it had never taught us how to handle a tyrannical stepfather, a manipulative spouse, or a family that used love as a weapon of control. We were trained for every conceivable external threat, but we were left completely vulnerable to the ones waiting for us back home. The idea came to me in a flash of clarity. It wasn't just a support group. It needed to be a formal, Army-sanctioned program. A confidential resource that provided soldiers with legal guidance, financial counseling, and a safe channel to report domestic abuse that wasn't physical. It needed to be a weapon. I spent the next 3 weeks working with a fervor I hadn't felt since preparing for the trial. I wrote a formal proposal outlining the mission, the structure, and the necessity of the program. I gave it a name. I decided to take the very object that had been used to wound me and turn it into a symbol of protection. I called it the Saber Initiative. The saber is a symbol of an officer's trust and command, a tool to defend and lead. This program would do the same. With my proposal complete, I knew my first hurdle would be the old guard. I scheduled a meeting with a group of senior staff officers, colonels who had been in the Army since before I was born. Their reaction was exactly what I had feared. I presented my data, my case studies, my carefully prepared arguments. When I finished, one of them, a grizzled, stone-faced infantry colonel, took off his reading glasses and looked at me with open disdain. "Captain," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "the United States Army is not a social work agency. We are here to fight and win the nation's wars. This is a distraction. It's weakness." Another chimed in. "If a soldier can't manage their own family drama, how can we expect them to manage a platoon in combat? This is a personal problem, Berg, not an Army problem." Weakness. Personal problem. The same old words used to enforce silence. For a moment, the old despair threatened to surface, but then I looked down at the faint scar on my hand and thought of PFC Miller. My voice, when I replied, was cold and clear as steel. "With all due respect, Colonel," I said, meeting his gaze. "A soldier who is worried their spouse is draining their bank account back home is a soldier who is not 100% focused on their sector of fire. A soldier who is being psychologically tormented by their family is a soldier whose readiness is compromised. This isn't about drama. This is about force protection. It's about ensuring that every soldier is mentally and emotionally prepared to do their job. This is a mission readiness issue." I had used their language, their logic. It left them speechless, but I knew I hadn't won them over. I needed more firepower. I needed General Whitaker. I presented the initiative to him and his command staff the following week. This time, I was ready. I laid out the tactical argument first, the impact on readiness, on morale, on soldier retention. I used charts and statistics. I was the perfect logical staff officer. Then, I changed tactics. I told them about PFC Miller. I didn't use her name, but I told her story. And for the first time, I told them a little of mine. Not the dramatic details, but the core truth. "Gentlemen," I finished, my voice quiet but carrying across the silent conference room. "We ask our soldiers to be prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice for this country. The least we can do is ensure they have a safe flank to return to. We need to protect them from the enemies they can't see, the ones they never trained to fight." The room was silent. The colonels who had dismissed me before were now staring at the table, unable to meet my eyes. General Whitaker, who had listened intently without a word, finally spoke. He looked around the room, his gaze resting on each officer. "She's right," he said simply. He stood up, a clear sign the meeting was over. "The Saber initiative is approved. Draw up the implementation plan, Captain. I want it on my desk by Friday." He walked over to me as the other officers filed out. "That took courage, Rowan," he said quietly. "No, sir," I replied, a small smile touching my lips for the first time in what felt like forever. That was just learning how to live. The work was just beginning. There were policies to write, resources to gather, and a culture to change. But as I sat at my desk that night, finalizing the presentation slides for the program's official rollout, I knew exactly where the new mission would begin. 1 year later, I returned to the parade ground at Fort Liberty. The North Carolina sun felt different this time, warm and life-giving, not harsh and oppressive. The scent of cut grass and polish was still in the air, but today it smelled like home. I stood on a raised platform, looking out at a sea of young, eager faces, the next generation of Army leaders. On my shoulder, the silver oak leaf of a major had replaced the gold of a captain. And I was here not as a recipient of an award, but as the keynote speaker for their leadership course graduation. I had returned to the scene of my greatest humiliation, not as a victim, but as a testament to what comes after. I looked down at my left hand. A thin, silvery scar traced the line where the saber had struck me. It was a part of me now, a permanent reminder. But when I flexed my fingers, there was no pain. As I stepped up to the podium, I saw them. Hundreds of future lieutenants, their uniforms immaculate, their futures bright with possibility. They saw a major, a decorated officer, a speaker. They didn't know the ghosts that had once haunted this very ground. It was my job to tell them, not about the ghosts, but about how to defeat them. "Good morning," I began, my voice clear and steady, amplified by the speakers across the field. "They'll teach you a lot about leadership in your careers. They'll talk about tactics, strategy, and logistics. They will speak at length about honor. And I am here today to tell you what honor truly is." I paused, letting my eyes travel over the crowd. Honor is not about perfection. It is not about an unblemished record or a flawless career. That's a myth. Honor is about truth. It's about facing the truth of who you are, what you've done, and what's been done to you, with unwavering clarity. Honor is about resilience. It's not about invulnerability. It's about acknowledging your wounds and choosing to heal. And most importantly, honor is not about never falling. Honor is about how you rise. I looked pointedly at the spot where I had fallen, where my blood had stained the grass. It is about how you rise, even when you are bleeding. It is about how you choose to stand your ground, not for the crowd, not for the cameras, but for the person you are determined to become. That is the honor that matters. That is the honor that will make you your leaders. I kept the rest of my speech short, focused on the practical applications of the Saber initiative, which was now active on bases across the country. I spoke about recognizing the signs of abuse, about creating a climate of trust where soldiers felt safe to ask for help, about the undeniable link between a soldier's well-being at home and their effectiveness on the battlefield. I was giving them the tools I never had. After the ceremony, as the newly graduated officers were celebrating with their families, a young lieutenant approached me. She was sharp, confident, the very picture of a future leader. "Major Berg," she said, her voice filled with a sincere respect that touched me deeply. "I need to tell you, that video of you, from your ceremony here last year, it went around my OCS class. I was on the verge of quitting. I didn't think I had what it took. Seeing you stand there, seeing you salute, that's the reason I'm in this uniform today. Thank you, ma'am." I didn't offer a long reply. I didn't need to. I just looked at her, saw the fire in her eyes, and knew that my story had become a part of hers. I simply nodded. "Congratulations, Lieutenant. Go make a difference." My mission was already working. As she walked away to join her proud parents, a familiar voice came from behind me. "She's not the only one you know." I turned. General Whitaker, now retired, stood there in a civilian polo shirt and slacks. He looked relaxed, happier. The immense weight of command finally lifted from his shoulders. "I've received dozens of letters," he said, a proud smile on his face. "From drill sergeants, from company commanders. They say the Saber initiative is one of the most impactful leadership tools they've been given in a decade. You did good, Rowan." "We did good, sir," I corrected him. We stood together for a moment, watching the families take pictures, the scene a perfect portrait of pride and joy. "So, have you forgiven him?" he asked quietly, the question unexpected. I knew he meant Ethan. I thought about it for a moment, honestly and without defense. The old, familiar anger wasn't there anymore. The bitterness was gone. "I don't think about him," I said, and I was surprised to find that it was the truth. "I've realized something, sir. Forgiveness isn't a gift I give to him. It was never about him. Forgiveness is my peace, and I had to fight like hell to win that peace for myself. He doesn't get to have any part of it." Whitaker nodded, understanding completely. "You finally finished your war, Berg." I looked out across the parade ground, at the American flag flying crisp and proud against the blue sky. I felt the warmth of the sun on my face, and for the first time, I felt truly at peace. The scar on my hand was just a scar. The ghosts were gone. "Maybe I have, General," I said, a real smile forming on my lips. "But I've learned that some wars aren't meant to end. They're just meant to change. They become something new." I turned to him, my eyes clear, my future an open field of infinite possibility. And now, I'm ready. And so, my war has found its peace. Thank you for walking this path with me. My journey from that parade ground to this moment has taught me one thing above all. Our scars don't have to be a source of shame. They can be our greatest source of strength, a testament to what we have survived. Every one of you listening has your own story, your own battle fought in silence. If this journey resonated with you, I invite you to join a community of survivors by leaving a comment below with 3 simple words. I am ready. And if you believe that every story of resilience deserves to be heard, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. You are not alone here, and our stories are our power. Thank you for listening.